Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios, and today the self-inflicted Stockholm Syndrome continues with my top 5 original Line 6 pod tones, and by extension the Pod Pro, Pod 2.0, and of course the Pocket Pod. If you've not been around the channel recently or at all, I'll give you a little refresher. I actually shot out every model of Line 6 pod kidney bean, so HD, X3, XT, and of course the original. And even though all those products, and especially the sophisticated amp modelers and real heads I have in this place, far exceed the capabilities of this thing, there is something that keeps drawing me back to this. Whether it be its simplicity or its pseudo analog sound, I don't know what it is, but something makes me want to work with this more. So I figured to continue the kidney bean carnage, I'd share a handful of my favorite setups that I stumbled upon while working with this thing. And it should be noted that this is upgraded to the Pod 2.3 firmware, so this is technically a 2.0, though everything I'm sharing today will work on all of this first generation pre-XT kind of stuff, or indeed anything based on the Pod or Pod 2.0 firmware, like, you know, the Floor Pod and Pod Farm, presumably, if you wanted to translate the settings over to there. So I'll show everything that I did in Line 6 Edit, which is a program that's sort of ancient, but you can edit parameters that you may otherwise not have access to on the front panel via MIDI. And if you really want to have access to those, I'll put a link in the description, but otherwise just kind of copy the settings as you see fit. So the first one I want to start with is kind of a hidden feature on the original line of pods, because when these released, there was actually a separate bass pod line. So you had a black bean, you had a black Pro, a floor bass pod, I believe, at some point. So one might naturally infer that there's no bass tones to be had on this device, right? Why else would they segment that to a completely different product line? Well, the secret is, if you dig around just a little bit, you'll find that there's a couple of bass-specific pieces of gear being modeled on here. And the first major revelation is if you go around here to the 4x10 section of the cabinet models, you'll find two, one of which is a 4x10 bassman. Shouldn't really need a whole lot of explanation there. And Line 6's own interpretation of the 4x10. I prefer the Line 6 model for more aggressive genres, and the bassman's kind of like your smoother classic rock, jazz kind of sound to me. Just using that alone already puts it in bass territory no matter what amplifier model you're using, even if it's just the bog standard tube preamp. And you can get some good sounds out of that if you're just looking for a clean DI kind of tone. Of course, you can move up to, say, the Tweed Blues, which is modeling a Fender Bassman. Again, sort of intended for guitar players that use that kind of rig, but if you dial it in for a bass, you get a workable bass tone. Where the real magic for me comes in handy in terms of heavy metal rock bass sounds is this pod layer model. And I believe this is something they may have switched around on the 2.0 and even on like the Pod Pro, the labeling changes a little bit. But if you can find that amp model, this is really interesting because when you start with drive at 0, it's basically completely clean. But as you dial up the drive, it actually blends a clean and dirty signal together, which is kind of the trick when it comes to heavy metal bass guitar. Combine that with a 4x10, crank the bass, middle treble to taste, and especially if you have a bass with a decent preamp and, you know, some active EQ controls, you can actually get some really respectable sounds out of this. So if you take nothing else away from this video and you need some quick bass tones for an emergency gig situation or just to lay down some ideas at home, then look no further than the original pod. Clean amplifier tones is where Line 6 has really excelled at since their beginnings as an amp modeling company. That's really epitomized by the black panel amplifier model, which is one of my favorites on here. It's of course based on a Fender Deluxe, and it's my go-to if I'm looking for that kind of sparkly American clean sound. Anything from progressive metal to just getting a touch of dirt if you throw a particularly hot, say, neck humbucker on it, get some great sounds out of that when it's driven hard. The kind of general Magic 6 settings work like a champ. Of course, you can dial up the bass a little higher and get something that's a little more contemporary sounding. But my biggest advice here to get the best sounds possible is, number one, use the compressor. It sounds great. Any Fender amp kind of plays well with compressors. It's generally the sound that I think of. The spring reverb model sounds great on it as well. But the biggest trick to kind of getting the hi-fi tone is to change the default 1x12 cabinet sound to one of the 2x12s. And there's multiple of them that sound good. The AC30 sounds pretty cool. But the Fender 2x12 model in particular takes this from like a small in the room combo sound to something that's full-fledged and kind of sounds more like a full stack. So that's kind of the model territory I tend to stick around, and throw any effect and guitar you want at it. It sounds awesome. Another honorable mention for the clean side of things is the Cali Clean model. This is one of my favorites as well, and it models your quintessential Mesa Boogie Mark Series clean preamp sound, and it reacts pretty accurately for the modeling tech we're talking about, where you can drive it hard, turn up the bass and middle, and get a kind of a woofy, overdriven Fender bassman sound, but it does like the cleanest of cleans as well. So definitely worth checking out if you're into that sort of sound. There's other great ones as well, but when it comes to clean tones, that's kind of where I like to reside. Number 3 brings us to the Brit High Gain model, which is where I start for basically anything halfway crunchy or resembling a distorted Marshall tone, because this indeed models the JCM 800, and it's a really versatile model, maybe one of the most versatile on here, because though it certainly does the JCM super lead thing with the higher drive settings, the lower you go, it kind of resembles more of a jumped plexi, which is really interesting. No doubt contributes this to being one of the highest rated models on here. But it's kind of cool. You can max out the tone stack and it does the brown sound or something approaching that. You roll off the bass, treble about there, lower drive, you can get kind of the quintessential classic rock tone, Alex Lifeson, all of that can be around here. So if you play in a classic rock cover band and you want a tone on the cheap, definitely give this a shot. It's really actually serviceable. It plays well with most of the cabinets on here as well, though of course the 4x12s is where you'll want to stick. These stock 70-watt speakers are great. There's a Marshall with V30s. The Line 6 4x12 sounds awesome as well with it, and the greenbacks is without a doubt the least usable of the bunch, but that kind of depends on the firmware as well. But another honorable mention would be the Brit Classic, which is more or less your plexi sound, and the Brit Blues, which is JTM 45 for edge of breakup stuff. All the Marshall kind of sounds on here are relatively useful, but the high gain's where it's at. I can't talk about an original pod without at least mentioning the Rectified amp model, which is perhaps my single favorite one on this entire platform. Obviously, I'm a bit of a Rectifier fan, but there's something about this amp model they were never able to replicate with later versions. The Pod HD sounded the most like the real amp, but there's something about this that even compared to the tread plate number 2 they have on here, if you hold down the tap tempo button on a 2.0, that one just kind of sucks compared to this. It's not, again, extremely accurate. The tone stack doesn't behave the same way, but it sounds cool, and I'm a bit biased on it because I'm pretty sure this is what Meshuggah used on the original recording of Nothing. In fact, that plus the stock 70s, put a preamp in front, you got the tone. But yeah, there's just something very unique and very characteristic about this that you hear it and you go, yeah, it's kind of Mesa Boogie sounding, but also not. And it has its own character. So this definitely benefits from the drive boost feature, where it kind of acts as a clean boost into the amp. And it's one of the few that if you're going for a contemporary sound, it really doesn't require a tube screamer or an EQ up front, though it definitely benefits from it if you're going for down tunings. But if you got like a drop C guitar with high output pickups, say voiced like an EMG, then you might be satisfied with just going straight through here. Many people were. Finally, for the now third consecutive high gain amp in a row, we have the modern high gain model based on a Soldano X88 preamp. And I find this to be vastly superior to the alternative high gain number 2, which you can get in the same position when holding tap tempo. That's supposedly based on the SLO head, though it doesn't really sound all that much or react like it, in my opinion. The thing with this is it also reacts well to the same sort of tricks as the Rectifier, where you enable that drive boost and put on maybe a touch of compression in the 2 to 3 ratio range, and it'll kind of sound like you're boosting it with a tube screamer, that sort of sound. So it works really well for rhythm, but this is kind of my go-to for leads. And especially on leads, it's one of the few that I find actually sounds decent with that very controversial greenback cabinet model. Though it's by default, I think, paired with a vintage 30, it works pretty well with all the 4x12s and even a couple of the 2x12s. A couple more honorable mentions to leave you with before I end this video, which probably puts me up to the top 10 territory, but who's counting anyway. Another amp to check out for leads is the Cali Crunch, which is supposedly based on a Mark IIc Plus. I kind of doubt its accuracy, but hey, whatever. The cool thing about it is actually it does have the tone stack pre-gain stage, which means rolling off the bass tightens up your guitar. And indeed, boosting the treble makes it higher gain, which is pretty cool. There's no graphic EQ, so you're going to have to be selective with the cabinet choice you make, but still one worth checking out. Unfortunately, if you're on 1.x firmware, then you'll have to scroll to the preset that uses that model and then edit it from there, or hook it up via MIDI, and then you can make a custom preset that way. But if you're on 2.0 or later, hold tap tempo, you'll find it. I believe it's on the Brit High Gain or Brit Classic, if I remember correctly. A couple other cool ones, they have Dumble Overdrive Special models, which again, who knows exactly how accurate they are, but they're fun sounds nonetheless. And if you're looking for a Class A kind of thing, I think the modern Class A, which is based on a Matchless Chieftain, is pretty cool. I think it's a bit more reliable than the Brit Class A. This one doesn't really sound all that much like a Vox, but Vox tones are very variable to begin with. So yeah, that's kind of my favorite tones from the original pod. If you enjoyed that, do let me know. If you have other ideas for that hunk of red junk, then let me know as well. But I think that'll about wrap it up. So thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.